All right, let's begin with prayer. Father, I just pray that your Spirit will be here today and pray that your words will be spoken, that you will open our hearts to ideas. We thank you for Shane's return. We pray for this church as we move forward in finding a new pastor. Pray that your will be shown to us and that we will honor your desires. Thank you for our time together here. Amen. So I don't have any new questions this week because the questions I gave last week will actually speak to next week. We're going to talk about the origin of the cosmos next week. But I did want to kind of give you some of the answers that you guys gave and just show sort of how there's a mixed opinion. So is the Bible a book of science? 20 of you said yes, and 10 said no. Does the Big Bang Theory contradict the Bible? 21 said yes, and 8 said no. Age of the earth. Young earth, 14. Old earth, 15. So we have various opinions concerning these questions, and so we'll speak to them over the next couple of weeks. So we're going to spend 3 weeks on science. This week on basic ideas about what science is. Next week, origin of the cosmos, and the following week, origin of life. And the idea being is that we, again, want to encourage us to not be afraid of the scientific world and not be afraid to hold on to biblical ideas. So our purpose is to pull the curtain back on the ideas of popular science intellectuals. Unlike the children's story, The Wizard of Oz, those who adopt these ideas don't get courage, they don't get a heart, or they don't get a brain. And these ideas being the ideas that the scientific intellectuals are putting forth. Instead, they get depression, they get drug abuse, they get gender confusion and hopelessness. In contrast, the God of the Bible, the creator of science, He created us out of the dust of the earth, answers all the questions of origin, purpose, and destiny. Now, it is critical that you guys understand that I am not against science by any means. In fact, my whole profession is based on scientific studies that direct how I do things. So I am very, very much in favor of good science. I am very opposed to bad science. And I'm very much opposed to scientism. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute.
Okay, so why should we, as Christians, give much thought to science? One really important reason is that it is the basis on which many young people turn away from the faith these days. Stephen Meyer, PhD scientific philosophy at Cambridge, reports that 65% of self-described atheists believe that science has replaced the need for God. In the last 10 years, the percentage of people who believe in God has decreased by 10%, largely in young people.
What's very fascinating right now and extremely enjoyable is that there is really good science being done by really smart Christian scientists. And frankly, even non-Christian scientists who are coming up and exploring the depths of the ocean and the intricacies of the cell and the vastness of the universe. And many of the ideas that have permeated the scientific community are now being called into question. Neo-Darwinism is one of those, and naturalistic cosmology. These two are in trouble. And in fact, the Neo-Darwinism is imploding under its own weight. Now, what's interesting, however, is that the universities are not faltering in their desire to teach neo-Darwinism or to teach naturalistic cosmology. Why? Why do they hold firm to that?
And this is true in secular or public or Christian universities as well. To get an idea of what they're facing, imagine that all the major news organizations tomorrow reported a letter from Paul that was just released by the Vatican. This occurred just prior to his death at the hands, in the letter Paul addressed to the church in Rome, he states that everything that he had previously reported was a lie. He denies having spent time in the desert with Christ, and he was a fraud. How would you respond?
What would you do? What would you think? What would you ask? Okay, so where was the letter found? Go ahead and use the mic.
I would have multiple questions if the letter is real, but also I would probably have a lot of doubt about, not the letter itself, but like about Paul. I'd probably feel very betrayed or just confused or try to find my own loophole around it or just look up evidence of how if the letter is real or not.
Okay. Authenticity.
The message is still there, regardless of whether or not that it was made by false statements. The message was still true.
So you're gonna cling to this thing, this fundamental.
Yeah, not necessarily what happened back years ago before I was born.
Okay.
But it's still there is some truth to the message, regardless of who said it.
Dan?
I would just say it's another example of disinformation.
So you're going to cling as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
I wouldn't trust anything coming out of the Vatican.
All right, we're going to move right on. All right, so the point being is that if something is so fundamental to your well-being and to your identity and to your future that you're not likely going to give up so quickly, because Christianity at its core is Christ and Christ's resurrection. So if there's any question about that truth, you're going to cling, you're going to hold fast. Well, this is the same thing that's going on in the scientific world, and that is the earth must be old. Darwinian evolution must happen. The cosmology has to be naturalistic Big Bang. It has to be, because otherwise you now have to consider God. All right? So they're clinging, understandably, because their basic worldview requires these things. So the definition of science, we'll start there, is a systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical world through, and these are critical, observation, experimentation, and the testing of their theories. So we're going to keep in mind those three things. We're going to observe, we're going to do experiments, and then we're going to test our results. All right, that's fundamental.
Okay, so that's science. Now, scientism, in contrast, claims that science alone can render truth about the world and reality. The only justifiable access to the truth is science or naturalism. Moral facts don't exist because there are no scientific evidence for them. Of course, they don't answer the major questions that humans ask, which are, why are we here? Where are we going, and what is the meaning of life? But nevertheless, this is a religion masquerading as science.
And so the idea that science has all the answers, science has some answers. There are going to be some things that science cannot answer. And often when they can't answer it, they become religious. And so we have scientists acting like theologians, when in fact their ideas come from atheism, and so their theology will come from atheism, as you could imagine. Now, what we should take heart from is that the foundation of science came from men who were Christians, or at least deists at the least. They, in fact, believed that as they observed nature and they looked at nature, that it was governed by laws and order, that it could be relied upon, that it could be reproduced, these laws. And so they applied those principles that they observed in nature to math and to biology and to cosmology, to all of the natural sciences, because they knew that at the core there was order, and that order came from God. Examples: Isaac Newton, probably one of the most impressive scientists of the history of man, was in fact a Christian and believed that the gravity came from a God who was so creative and created this law that was so critical, that is yet still not understood what gravity is, but he knew that this great creative God had done it. Galileo, Kepler, all three are considered the fathers of scientific revolution, all three involved in the Christian church. So there are two types of science that we'll talk about. One is historical science, and the other is experimental science. So historical science tries to understand things that have happened in the past, but no one was there to observe them. So they use current knowledge about things to try to get an idea about what happened back then, recognizing that it's not something you can test and no one was there. So this hourglass that I put up here, or someone put up here, don't know when, you can look at, and you could make some assumptions. And let's assume that, well, actually, we can know how fast the sand goes from here to here. We know that. We can calculate that. That's not difficult. We can then assume that the rate has been continuous the entire time. So we could see, you could tell me how long that hourglass has been in this position, unless there was sand in there already. Or unless someone came along and turned it on its side for a little while and then turned it back up. Or what if some of that sand, what if there was some moisture that got in and some of that sand clumped for a second or two or an hour or a day and then unclumped? So historical science makes these assumptions, and we'll talk about this a lot next week. But historical science makes the assumptions that the rate is always continuous, that there was no sand in the bottom at the beginning, and that no one turned it on its side for a period of time. All right. Can we prove those assumptions? Anyone here who thinks, oh yeah, I know for sure those things are true? You do? Oh, I knew it. All right. So when we talk about historical science, those are the assumptions that are being made with respect to dating rocks, how the cosmos was at the beginning. All right, so the question is this science? Is it really science? Can our assumptions be tested? Can we create a hypothesis that we can test? Or do we have a priori arguments that fundamentally guide our thinking about this dating?
Richard Lowenton is a Harvard evolutionary biologist, says we have an a priori commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to produce material explanation. That materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So this is scientism, otherwise known as a religion.
But if you're a pure scientist and you are looking just for answers, you want answers, and that's all you want, is there anything that should be eliminated from your approach to the question? All right. Experimental science. To acquire knowledge through direct observation and measurement of objects and phenomena. So one of the things that happens is that you observe things and you make or you draw conclusions about what you observe. And there are three sort of ways to do that. William Dembski, who is a mathematician, sort of came up with these three ideas. And one is chance, one is law, and one is design. So let's say you go out on a fall morning and you look at your tree and it's dropped leaves. And you look at the distribution of those leaves under the tree and you say, there's nothing special about that distribution. That was chance. It's irregular. It's not predictable. Nothing about it could I be surprised by. But you look and you say, but there is something that's going on here. All the leaves are on the ground. They're not floating in a dust cloud up above. They're all on the ground. And you could assume that there is a law governing the dropping of leaves. And that's gravity, of course. So we have a chance distribution of the leaves, but all governed by a law, gravity. Now, what if I walked out there one morning and it said an alien was here, printed in leaves? All the leaves, every single leaf that had dropped from that tree spelled out an alien was here. I'd go get Karen and say, is that what you're reading? She said, yeah, an alien was here. I'd go to my neighbor and say, do you do this? You know. But what we can see from that distribution of leaves is not chance, is not law. There's no law governing the fact that those leaves would spell an alien is here. So we have to assume from that there is design. Now, what we can't say is that it was God or an alien or my wife playing a trick on me. But we can say that there was design. Now, we would then have to figure out, okay, who did that? But the important element is, as we look at something, we intrinsically know there is design. When you see Mount Rushmore, no wind or law carved those faces on the face of that. You know there is design. When you walk past a book, you know that no chance or law wrote that book. You know there is design there. All right, that's going to be important when we talk about origin of life. All right, so these men of faith years ago created this scientific method. And this is really important to apply the scientific method to almost anything that we hear. And here are the elements of a scientific method. You ask a question, you make a prediction, that's your hypothesis, you gather data, you analyze the data, and then you draw conclusions. So, for example, I suspect all of you, if you've had kids, have dealt with one of your children having an earache. So you go to your pediatrician, and he says, I'm not going to put your kid on penicillin. And you think, well, why not? And he will say to you, well, we did a study, or a study was done, and we took 10,000 kids from all over the world, from a variety of ages, socioeconomic status, 10,000 kids. You need a big number to prove something, and that's also important. 5,000 of them, we gave them penicillin, and the other 5,000, we gave them a sugar pill. Now, they both look exactly the same, so you can't tell. And the prescriber doesn't know, and the parents don't know. That's important. The computer knows who assigns these pills. And then a week later, you have everybody come back, and you decide, did that penicillin pill, when you figure out who it was that got it, did it make any difference? And the answer is no. All right, that's scientific method. That's how we come to conclusions that we can feel comfortable about. And anytime we deviate from the scientific method, we may impose bias, or we may come up with incorrect conclusions, or we may have not had enough people in the study, and therefore our conclusions may be wrong. So as we look at studies, or we hear about things, we have to keep in mind, did they apply scientific method? Because if not, it may be false, even though on its face it looks good. And then that study gets repeated. So we don't generally rely on just one. We need several to prove what we think to be true.
Another thing to look out for is the difference between causation and association. Causation meaning that one thing causes another thing to happen, and then association meaning that at most there's a relationship there.
A year ago, I got the COVID booster. After getting 2 COVID shots before, I got the COVID booster. And since that time, I have not been able to run. Now, you should ask the question, well, could you run before? All right. No, I couldn't run before, and I can't run now, and so the COVID booster didn't help me to run. It's actually not true. But how old did you turn a year ago? Well, I turned 65, and maybe that's the problem. Or maybe I started working out and I injured myself. But the point being is that I have no idea whether the COVID booster decreased my ability to run or not. Can't know. That's association rather than causation. And again, so many things that we hear from the scientific community are really association and not causation. And we have to discern that. And again, the reason we're creating this foundation is that, as we've said before, your kids or grandkids are going to come back from the universities, and they're going to hear a lot of things that we need to just simply ask a few questions about the proofs that they have. So the things that we hear from the scientific community: trust the science. Yeah, sometimes we should definitely trust the science because it's good. But just because they say trust the science doesn't mean that we should. The science is settled. Wow. There are some things that the science is settled on, but there are some things that are not. Studies show. I love that one. Studies show. I had that conversation with my son about a month ago. The studies show, and I was just waiting for that one. We had a great time on that one. Or we so often do anecdotes. My grandfather lived to 90 and he didn't die of lung cancer, therefore it's okay to smoke. Well, that's an anecdote. It has absolutely nothing to do with science, and it's a notable fact, but it has nothing to do with our approach to science. Stephen Hawking, who has now passed, one of the great minds of our generation, said, we must choose between science and God. Why? Why would a man who is as brilliant as anyone we've seen make that comment? Why? Answers? Sorry? Phil? He didn't want to believe in God. Right. Yeah, it was contrary to his fundamentals.
His personal beliefs got in the way, I think. You know, everyone wants to, like, not everyone, but like, everyone has their own personal beliefs about God usually, or they either believe or they don't believe or they kind of do. And I think it gets to the point where people say, just because I believe in this, I'm the smartest person, then this must be true or something like that. Or because Stephen Hawking didn't believe in God, he thought, okay, I can prove it, and I already did because the Bible doesn't make sense to me, so so it's not true, which is weird. I don't really know why he wouldn't believe in God. It's just weird to me, I guess.
I think as community enforced that decision to be made, like, and with ego and pride, he in that community, it's almost laughable to believe in God, and so that probably got in the way too.
And we're seeing that, unfortunately, in the Christian universities, in the science departments, have endorsed things because they're afraid, or that is the water in which they swim.
I was going to say, that statement sounds like an oxymoron to me, because he cannot disprove the existence of God either. So why would he make a statement like that? The other thing I would say, as far as science is concerned, the great contention of today is the issue of climate. And the thing that bothers me is that this is very unsettled science, okay? But the media reports it as truth. And that's the thing that we have to be careful about. Just because the media repeats the hypothesis over and over and over again doesn't mean it's true. But as human beings, if we hear something long enough, we will start to believe it. And I think you can apply that to a lot of issues of our day.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
I think a lot of it has to go back to Romans 1, that all these things that have been clearly seen since the creation of the world, God's darkened their hearts, and people who claim to be fools or claim to be wise have become fools. And you see people that have the most highly educated, all these degrees, and yet they can't tell you what a woman is. They can't see things that clearly have been designed, but somebody right off the street in rural America could easily tell you. So I think there's a lot of judgment from that.
I thought it was interesting that he believes in an ordered universe to be able to believe in science, but not God. So.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I've been watching some different series on evolutionary, and they've been using such things, and you were talking about Dawkins there, doing him and another physicist decided to use quantum physics to go back, and one of their researches was to try and prove where the gravity began. They would get back so far. Other ones have used what they call reverse mathematics to take away from and go back to the beginning. The problem was each one of them got back so far and couldn't go any farther because they couldn't prove where the beginning was.
I think any time that you hear any scientific method or any new thing, let's say that, the news says scientists have proven the fourth dimension or something like that, which it already has, but it doesn't matter. But if if you don't believe it, or if you're skeptical about it, I would feel like instead of turning it away or saying it's dumb because it came from this one source, I would say that to do as much research as possible to figure out if it is true, and to look at the Bible and look at absorb every single opinion that you can find on the subject, instead of closing it off and just saying that's stupid because it came from CNN or something.
Yeah, I think it's a good point that we have to approach ideas as well, even if on their face they seem odd, with an open mind. And let's say, okay, let's look at the science, let's look at the source, let's just determine to the best of our abilities whether or not this is in fact reliable. Right?
One of the problems, I believe, is within the school system. We talked a little bit about that. They do not teach our children anymore how to reason, how to think. Right. They just want you to jump through the hoops, and these theories they teach as truth, and it's just compounded the further you go in education. And as parents, as Christians, we shouldn't be silent. We should challenge that. I'll just share really quick. I taught a lot up in the DeWitt school system, and I got called in for 3 straight days for general science, and guess what they were teaching? I decided on my own that I would teach all of the theories, including creation, order, design, theistic evolution, but I taught them as theories. That didn't go over real well at first with the teacher when he got back and we got together. And but as we worked through the theories, not being able to prove it, not being able to measure it, right, and not be able to duplicate it again, they, up in DeWitt school system, started teaching all the theories. So if we challenge it, we can have success and change, really, worldview.
We care much about the opinion of celebrities, and they come in a variety of forms, including your freshman biology teacher at the university. They are a celebrity. The athletes are celebrities. The actors and actresses are celebrities. Politicians are celebrities. And so there is nothing more influential to us and to our youth than the opinion of a celebrity, even though they are way outside their lane. All right, real quick.
Yeah, I think the reason why the law of the scientific community doesn't believe in God is based on just personal opinion of their own self, and taking their pride and ego into science when it shouldn't, and it should just be facts and logic, but they're putting their own personal beliefs into something that should not have personal beliefs.
Yeah, that's scientism. That's a religion, and it's important to distinguish between science and scientism. Okay. Acts 17.
Now the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true.
I mean, that's a celebrity, a pretty good one. But yet, they determined that they would examine what he said to see if they were true. And they were commended for that. We have that same responsibility to ourselves and to our kids and grandkids to examine what is being said to see if it's true. So, it is time we stop sacrificing our children upon the altar of science. We send them off to schools of higher education, and they return having been indoctrinated to bad ideas. Instead of wringing our hands, let's engage. We alone hold the truth. The Bible is a book that speaks to all aspects of life. We cannot be relegated to the halls of theology. Not that that's a bad hall to be in by any means. However, we also can walk down the halls of science and philosophy and economics and have opinions in those areas because foundationally they all came from God. Our approach now cannot only be the Bible says, because frankly, most of these kids haven't read it or don't care about what it says. We must address those bad ideas that come from bad science. And usually we will do that through questions. As I've said each of the last couple of weeks, my response to a bad idea to say that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard is not a good approach. But to approach it with, well, tell me about that. Where did you hear that? Tell me about the science. Did you look into it? And I can tell you for sure it was a headline on something that came across Google or YouTube or whatever it was, and they didn't bother to look into it. It was a headline. And so with grace, we can approach those gently, but with confidence, knowing that we have nothing to fear in the arena of science. Nothing that scientists come up with will ever contradict what the Bible fundamentally has to say.
Just to conclude, Francis Bacon's quote is appropriate here. A little science estranges a man from God. A lot of science brings him back.
Questions? We have a couple minutes. Anyone? Comments? Right behind you.
Just a couple of comments. One thing I look at in science, is secular science today, is that there is a lot of positive in it. Number one is, it's starting to prove that there had to be a design because it cannot come up with the beginning. But I'd like to make a comment around in the book of Acts. The Bereans were studying this. What scriptures were they studying? The New Testament hadn't been written.
Right.
They were studying the Old Testament scriptures.
And Paul's
Design,
letters.
creation, everything.
Right.
As the church, and there are certain churches, they call themselves the New Testament church, have moved away from the Old Testament. When you take that part out, then our children are not going to know that God created the heavens and the earth. And science, then, secular, evolutionary, will be easier to move into our children and to basically persuade them.
Kevin?
I had a question. Can you repeat? You asked that question about if we found out Paul's letters were false.
Right.
And then you had a point that you made after. Could you repeat that point for a point of the question?
Yeah, so the neo-Darwinists are clinging to this idea that this all came about by naturalistic process. And what would we do if, in fact, our foundations were challenged? Would we just give up right away? Or would we continue to fight? And so the idea behind the question is they are continuing to fight, even though their foundation is crumbling, because it is the basis of their theology. It has to be that we came about through this evolutionary process, because if in fact that falls, then they have to consider God, and they are not inclined to consider God. So what would we do?
So scientists think we're clinging too.
And they think we're clinging, absolutely. Yeah, they do for sure.
This is just an anecdote to go along with what you were saying, but the person who might be America's greatest homegrown physicist was a guy named John Wheeler from Princeton University. And John Wheeler, absolutely brilliant fellow who's had other really brilliant physicists follow in his tracks, decided he had such trouble with looking at the fine-tuning of the universe and his commitment that there couldn't be a God. So what John Wheeler did was develop a theory that humanity continues to grow and evolve to a place where it can actually go back and change the past, and humanity creates itself. And I mean, it's an extraordinary idea, and yet it's attracted attention in the theoretical physics community. And I think the whole point is we can't have a God. We just can't have one.
Absolutely.
Whatever it takes, we have to figure out a way not to have a God.
Next week, we're going to talk about the fine-tuning of the universe that you brought up, and it's just outstanding. And then how they are clinging to this idea that there is no God, and the theories that they're coming up with that are just like that. You think, why not just give up? And the reason they can't give up, and that they're inclined to theories that are absurd but gain traction, is because they're clinging.
I think,
Go ahead.
to your point, Kevin, they're clinging and we're clinging. But which one of us is clinging to the truth that matches the reality of the universe?
Well spoken. Bob?
As those who have been redeemed, we put a lot of confidence in the Bible. What we have to anchor our faith in is the person whose words are recorded in the Bible. God backs up his words. It isn't what I say or what my opponent says. But if I am quoting a scripture that he does not even want to hear, the fact is, the last word is God's. And there are so many proofs in the Bible that what God said he brought to pass.
Absolutely.
They're there. And we need to rely not on our wisdom or theirs, because God has the last word. And when we understand that and quote even one verse, and I could tell you some stories where I've seen conversions through that God will back that up, and that person will have some struggles with it when you're not even around.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. 1 minute.
I think, I could be wrong about this, so this is my personal opinion here, but I feel like scientifically, at least from what I know, or at least of what the scientific community knows now, you can't really disprove or prove God, like to me at least. It's more of a, at least scientifically, but to me it's like you look around at people and how the Bible changes people's lives, or certain things in the universe that you could say, yeah, scientifically God is real, but also you can't really disprove him either. It's kind of like a both situation where it's like, what proof do you have? And it's like, not enough. And it's like the scientific community is latching on to you can disprove God, even though to me that's weird, because there are certain things in the universe as a three-dimensional person that you cannot see or understand fully or grasp at all. And I think saying that you can disprove something without giving any evidence that it's disproven is just weird. It's not necessarily scientific.
Yeah. Well, we will, in the next 2 weeks, and we'll give you the last word, the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at what is science showing us, and then pick a side. Now, I'm pretty confident that I know what side you guys are going to pick, but with scientific evidence, we can pick a side that makes the most sense and is based on our observations and what the science community is coming up with.
I think it's important to remember that scriptures don't get into the mechanics of how God did what he did. It just happened. It doesn't explain exactly that, and if going into the evolution thing, as an engineer, if I'm going to develop two cars and I want, I'm going to use the base of the first car to build the second car. So, it's possible that, God took a monkey and used that as the basis to build a man out of.
We'll talk about that one. You and I might have a little problem with that, but that's okay. Final.
Weapons. And what they do is they ridicule us to cause a reaction, and then our reaction is used against us. So there's a saying, if you wrestle with pigs, you're going to get dirty. And so what you need to learn how to do is how to fight this. And this cannot be won logically, because we're not playing by the same sets of rules. That's very important. So we need to remember that our testimony in our life is going to win people over. How we love, how we live and serve is really going to break through to the people that have a heart that can be broken through to.
Yeah, so even how we engage them. And that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is that when you come face to face with someone whose opinion you disagree with and are fundamental, how do you approach them? And you do it with love and grace, and with good questions, and develop friendships. So yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I know Wikipedia is not a great source, but it gives you the most concise, simple explanation of what those rules are.
Yes.
The rules for radicals. Just read through them, and you'll see how they're fighting, and it can prepare you to know how to deal with these people.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. All right, we'll see you next week.